Royce lunged with a roar, swinging wide, but Marcus moved first. In one fluid motion, he caught the man's arm midair, twisted, and slammed him chest first into the table. And just like that, the entire diner froze. Hi, everyone. Today we're stepping into a small, forgotten diner on the edge of Route 66, a place where time feels stuck and assumptions run deep. A place where one quiet man's presence turned an ordinary afternoon into something nobody would ever forget. This isn't a tale about shouting or chaos, it's a story about calm, about control, and about how sometimes silence says everything. This could happen to anyone, even you. So before we dive into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Let's begin. The wind cut low across the plains that afternoon, slipping beneath truck doors and tugging at the edges of flannel jackets like it had a purpose of its own. Marcus Hale, 47, leaned forward behind the wheel of his old Ford pickup, watching the road stretch endlessly through the New Mexico flatlands. His eyes flicked toward the fuel gauge quarter tank. He wasn't worried, not the kind of man who rushed anything, especially not lunch. That's when he saw it. A flicker of neon red and blue. Open, the sign stammered, half alive in the dusty window of a squat white building just off the road. A battered Shell station sat beside it like an aging sibling. And behind the diner, nothing. Just open land and dry, brittle sky. Marcus turned into the gravel lot without hesitation. The truck tires crunched loudly over the stone, like the world had gone quiet just to hear him arrive. He sat there for a moment. Engine off. Still. Then reached across the seat, grabbed his old wool cap and stepped out. Boots hitting gravel. One steady breath. Another. And then he walked toward the door. The diner was called Lila's, though the name on the sign had long since lost a few letters. The bell above the entrance let out a hard jangle as he stepped inside, slicing through the low hum of the place. Every conversation paused. The silence that followed wasn't just awkward. It was loaded, measured. He felt it before he saw it, how every head in the room had turned slightly, not all the way, but just enough to see. Marcus didn't meet their eyes. He didn't need to. He took in the scene with a quiet sweep. 5 booths along the left wall. 3 of them occupied. A pair of old men playing cribbage by the window. A young couple at the bar. And then, in the far right corner, a group of 6 men, leather vests, sunglasses, boots caked in road dust. Loud laughter that stopped the moment Marcus walked in. They watched him. Watched the way he moved. The way his back stayed straight, his pace, even his expression unreadable. Marcus walked toward an open booth by the window, sat down with his back to the wall. He always sat where he could see the exits. Not paranoia, just habit. A waitress approached, mid-50s, thin frame hair tied in a bun that had lost its shape hours ago. Her apron was clean, but her eyes were tired. "What'll it be?" she asked. Her voice held no warmth, but no hostility either. Just survival. Marcus looked up gently. Cheeseburger, fries, coffee black. She nodded, scribbled, didn't smile. But something in her posture shifted as if she wanted to. She glanced quickly toward the bikers before heading to the back. Marcus waited in silence. He didn't pull out a phone, didn't scan the menu again. He just sat still as stone fingers resting on the cracked Formica table. Behind him, the voices started up again, quieter this time, but directed. "You see that guy?" one murmured. "City type," another laughed. "Looks like he's lost. Maybe looking for trouble." The words were coded in mockery, but Marcus didn't flinch. He heard the boots before he saw the man. Heavy steps across linoleum. One of the bikers, stocky mid-40s beard, streaked with gray tattoos winding up both arms, walked up to the counter and leaned over, talking loudly to the waitress. "Hope the kitchen's wearing gloves," he chuckled. "Don't want our food touched by strangers." The others at the table snickered, the sound sharp like gravel under tires. The waitress didn't respond. She poured coffee, handed it to Marcus with a faint nod, then walked away. Marcus wrapped his hands around the mug. Warm, steady. Still no reaction. Still no eye contact. And that's what got under their skin, because nothing makes insecure men more dangerous than being ignored. Royce, the leader, stood up slowly. You could hear his chair scrape. He took his time crossing the floor, each step calculated, dragging the moment like a threat. He stopped beside Marcus's booth. Too close. His shadow spilled across the table. "Well, well," he said, voice thick with false amusement. "You always ignore friendly folks or just the white ones." No answer. Royce leaned in slightly. "You lost, buddy. Still nothing. You hear me?" Marcus finally looked up, eyes calm, voice low. "Something I can help you with." Royce's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected that. Not calm, not polite. He wanted fear or fire. Instead, he got a mirror. The room went quiet again. Forks paused. Mugs froze halfway to lips. The waitress stood behind the counter watching without moving. Royce chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You're sitting where you don't belong, friend." Marcus took a sip of coffee, set the mug down. Didn't see a sign. That was it, but that was enough. Royce's hand twitched, his lips curled, and somewhere deep inside he made a choice. A wrong one. The thing about bad decisions is that they usually look like confidence right before they fall apart. Royce's hand slammed down on the table hard enough to rattle the salt shaker and jolt the ketchup bottle off balance. The clatter pierced through the quiet diner like a warning shot. The waitress flinched behind the counter. The couple at the bar glanced over but didn't move. Nobody did. Not even Marcus. He didn't flinch. Didn't blink. He simply shifted his gaze from the window to Royce's hand. That stillness. It was disarming. Royce didn't understand it, and it made him angrier. Because to men like him, control was about noise, about presence, about volume. And Marcus was none of those things. "You think you're better than me?" Royce growled, leaning in the sour scent of cigarette smoke and cheap beer clouding the space between them. "You walk in here like you own the place. You think you don't gotta answer when somebody talks to you?" Marcus's voice came quiet, controlled. "I didn't come here to talk." Royce's face twitched. "Yeah." Another pause. Then Marcus added, "I came here to eat." That did it. The words weren't aggressive, weren't defensive, but they cut deep because they weren't afraid. Royce grabbed at Marcus's collar. He never made it. Marcus moved like the shift of wind before a storm, silent, fast, certain. His hand came up, seized Royce's wrist midair, and twisted it sideways just enough to freeze the motion. Royce grunted, not in pain, in confusion, in disbelief. Marcus stood slowly, still holding Royce's wrist, and turned the momentum back on him. With a short, practiced step, he guided Royce down onto the table face, pressed to the surface arm behind his back legs, wobbling like an unbalanced stool. The entire diner gasped. It wasn't the kind of move you learn from bar fights or boxing matches. It was surgical, clean, effortless. Marcus leaned in close, his voice even. "You can walk away now, or you can limp later." For a moment, Royce didn't speak. Couldn't. He just breathed hard. Then he snarled, "You're dead, man." Marcus let go. Royce stumbled backward, tripping into a chair and knocking it over as he regained his footing. His face was red more from embarrassment than pain. He turned to his crew. "Get up, now." The other five stood slowly, their smirks fading. A man in mirrored sunglasses cracked his knuckles. Another rolled his neck like he was warming up for a fight. They began circling the booth. Marcus didn't move. He didn't crouch into a stance or square his shoulders like someone expecting a fight. He just watched them, measured. Still. The waitress picked up the phone behind the counter. "Don't," Royce barked. She froze fear, locking her fingers. The man with the sunglasses stepped forward first. He swung a wide, angry arc meant to intimidate more than land. It never connected. Marcus ducked, pivoted, and let the man's own force carry him forward. A knee to the gut folded him over. Marcus grabbed his vest, spun him, and planted him face first into the nearest booth. One down. The wiry guy with greasy hair rushed next, letting out a yell to mask the panic in his eyes. Marcus sidestepped, caught his shirt, and used his own momentum to send him tumbling over the counter. Two down. The third came from behind, swinging a chair like a club. Marcus dropped low, the chair whooshed overhead, and Marcus rose beneath his arms, driving an elbow into his ribs. The man gasped, dropping the chair, and Marcus shoved him backward into a wall, where he crumpled to the floor. Three down. Royce lunged again, roaring now not from courage but desperation. Marcus turned, caught his arm, and delivered a clean palm strike to Royce's chest that knocked him flat onto his back. He slid a few inches across the floor, groaning. 4 down. The fifth man froze. He looked at his crew, groaning, wheezing, doubled over. Then he looked at Marcus and bolted. The bell above the diner door screamed as he pushed through it and vanished into the parking lot. Silence. Not a word. Not a breath. The only sound in the diner now was the soft buzzing of that broken neon sign outside, humming like it had been watching all along. Marcus stood in the center of the chaos, his breathing even, shirt still tucked in. He hadn't even broken a sweat. He looked around at the mess, then walked back to his booth, slid in, reached for his coffee, took a sip. The waitress stood frozen behind the counter, her mouth slightly open. She looked at the plate of food still waiting under the warmer, then back at Marcus. She finally found her voice. I'll get you a fresh burger." Marcus shook his head gently. "No need. This one's just fine." She blinked, nodded, then walked it over on shaking legs. A man near the door, older trucker hat in hand, spoke for the first time. What the hell are you?" Marcus didn't answer. Another patron mumbled, "You military or something?" Marcus didn't look up. He lifted a fry, took a bite, and said quietly, "Just a man trying to eat in peace." Nobody in the diner moved. It was that kind of silence, the kind that didn't ask for quiet but demanded it. The kind that shows up when something sacred has been broken or rewritten. Like a church right after a sermon that hit a little too close. The waitress stepped backwards slowly, as if even her breath might trigger something. Royce, groaning on the floor near the booth, rolled onto his side and sat up halfway, his hands gripping his ribs. His face was pale-mouthed, open eyes wide, not just from pain but disbelief. He looked at Marcus the way a man looks at a thunderstorm he didn't believe in until it struck his house. "What the hell are you?" he rasped. Marcus didn't answer. Not right away. He wiped his hands on a napkin, calm as ever, as if all he'd done was return a dish to the sink. He wasn't even looking at Royce, just finishing his burger, bite by bite, controlled, intentional. Royce tried to stand, bracing himself on the corner of the table. It took 2 tries. From the other side of the diner, someone whispered, "He moved like a ghost." "No," said another voice, like he'd done it 100 times. The waitress, still pale, leaned on the counter. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft and uneven. Marcus looked up, gave her a faint smile. "I'm fine, ma'am, but you might want to call someone. They're gonna need a medic more than a cop." That made a few heads turn, because he didn't say it with bravado. He said it like a man who knew the difference. Behind the counter, the cook peered out from the kitchen window, spatula still in hand, jaw half dropped. He hadn't moved since the second biker went down. "Lord help me," he muttered. "Who just walked into my place?" Royce's legs gave out again. He slumped back against the booth and sat there, breathing hard. He wasn't looking at Marcus anymore. He was looking at the floor, at the broken remains of pride and assumption scattered across the tiles. "I don't get it," Royce finally muttered, voice raw. "You didn't look like nothing. You looked normal." That made Marcus pause. He set his coffee down, met Royce's eyes, and said, "That's the point." And it was. Because men like Marcus don't walk around advertising what they've seen, what they've done. They don't carry their pasts on their sleeves. They carry them in their posture, in the way they wait, the way they don't respond when they're expected to, until it's necessary. The man who'd fled earlier hadn't come back. One of the other bikers, still groaning from where he lay, crumpled near the jukebox, mumbled something about calling it quits. The wiry one with the greasy hair had finally pulled himself back into a booth, where he now sat, eyes darting, shoulders slumped, nursing his stomach. Marcus stood up again, not quickly, not slowly, just with finality. He pulled a few bills from his wallet, crisp and clean, and placed them under the edge of the plate. "Thank you for the coffee," he said to the waitress. "And for not looking away." She blinked. I didn't do anything. You didn't do nothing either." Her eyes softened. "Do you want... should I call someone for you?" Marcus paused, adjusted his cap, and replied, "No, ma'am. I think they'll remember this without help. The door jangled as he stepped outside, the sound, as sharp and sudden as it had been when he first arrived, but now it rang differently, like punctuation, like an end. Out in the gravel lot, the wind had shifted. The clouds overhead had broken slightly and a single shaft of sunlight hit the hood of Marcus's truck. He climbed in without hurry, turning the key just as the last remaining biker stumbled out after him. The man didn't speak. He just stood near his bike, hands shaking, watching Marcus with a kind of reverence usually reserved for preachers or ghosts. Marcus rolled the window down halfway, looked at him. "You don't have to be like them," he said gently. "You know that, right?" The man nodded slowly, then a little faster, and just like that, Marcus pulled away, gravel kicking up behind his tires as the truck rumbled back onto the highway, back into the wind, back into the quiet. Inside the diner, the buzz of low conversation slowly returned, but nothing sounded the same. People spoke softer, moved slower, like a truth had been dropped into the room and nobody knew where to put it. The waitress turned toward Royce, who was still sitting on the floor. "You want me to call someone for you?" she asked, a little steel in her voice now. He didn't respond. He just stared at the door. It didn't take long for word to spread. Even before Marcus's truck disappeared fully down Route 66, the small town of Eldridge was already buzzing. Not because someone filmed it, nobody even thought to. Not because it was on the news, it never would be. But because something that real doesn't need cameras. It echoes on its own. At the gas station next to the diner, the teenage clerk looked up when he saw the truck roll out, the gravel mist still floating behind it like dust from a movie scene. He didn't know what had happened inside Lala's diner, but he could feel it. Something had shifted. Something had broken and reformed in the space of a few minutes. Inside the diner, the waitress, her name was Doris, finally set the phone down without dialing. She'd hovered over those buttons for a while, but now looking around, she wasn't sure what to report. 6 men were down. Only one of them was still trying to look angry. That was Royce, and even his face had changed. He wasn't yelling anymore. He wasn't barking threats. He was just sitting there, ribs hurting, ego crushed, looking at the door like it might open again and bring Marcus back. It wouldn't. Marcus Hale didn't double back. He left lessons behind the way some men leave business cards. Royce finally pulled himself upright with a groan and staggered back toward the others. One biker clutched a paper napkin to his nose. Another leaned his head back against the booth, breathing like a man who'd seen lightning up close. Nobody made eye contact with each other. "I told you not to mess with him," the wary one mumbled, voice tight. "You didn't say a damn thing," Royce snapped, but even that was limp. He knew it wasn't true. He was grasping, reaching for anything that would help him stitch his dignity back together. But the truth was obvious. They'd picked a fight not because Marcus had done anything wrong, but because he didn't act afraid. That's what made them feel challenged. That's what exposed them. And that's what broke them. Doris walked out from behind the counter, holding a small blue cloth she didn't need. She glanced at the wrecked chairs and overturned salt shakers, then at Royce. "You boys need anything?" Royce looked at her, then away. "No," he muttered. "We're good." She gave him a long look. "Doesn't look like it." An older man from the corner booth chuckled, one hand still resting on his coffee cup. "I ain't seen anything like that since—" "Nam," he said. His companion nodded. "No yelling. No flexing. Just snap and it was done." Royce turned, eyes flaring. "You think that makes him tough, being quiet?" The old man smiled. "No, I think it makes him dangerous. You just figured that out the hard way." Royce opened his mouth, then closed it again. No comeback. No point. The other bikers shuffled out one by one, limping, nursing bruises, avoiding everyone's gaze. When they reached the parking lot, the wind picked up again, that dry kind of breeze that carries dust and shame equally well. Royce stopped beside his bike, stared at it for a second, like it had betrayed him. Then he looked back at the diner, as if still expecting Marcus to be standing in the doorway, with a look that said, "Ready for round 2, but the door stayed shut, and Marcus was long gone. Somewhere down the road, his truck hummed steadily beneath the open sky. Inside the cab, Marcus adjusted the rearview mirror and tapped the steering wheel lightly with one hand. Not out of tension, not out of pride, just presence. That quiet awareness of the road, the wind, and what he'd left behind. He didn't feel triumphant. That wasn't his way. He didn't carry himself like a man who'd won something, because in his mind he hadn't. There'd been no contest, no scoreboard, just a choice and a line. They had crossed it. He had answered. And now it was done. The road stretched ahead like it always had, flat and endless. A hawk circled above in the distance. He watched it for a second, then glanced at the dash clock. Still early afternoon. Maybe he'd stop again in another 100 miles. Not every diner was like that. Not every table came with trouble. But Marcus was always ready, not because he wanted to be, but because life had taught him not to assume the best. Back in Eldridge, the rest of the day limped forward. By dinner, the incident had already been retold 3 different ways, none of them exaggerated, just shaped by perspective. He barely moved. One man said at the barbershop. Didn't even stand up at first. He disarmed 6 men like he was tying his shoes, said another at the pharmacy. And I swear, he smiled after. At the diner, Doris cleaned up the mess without saying much. But when the sheriff finally came by after hearing chatter around town, she just told him flatly, nothing worth writing up. One man protected himself. The rest embarrassed themselves. The sheriff, a gray-haired man with tired boots, looked around at the scuffed tables and broken chair legs, then nodded. Sounds like justice. And that was that. Royce didn't come back to Lila's for a while. When he finally did months later, he sat quietly at the bar and never once raised his voice. Some lessons don't need to be repeated. The horizon was dipped in amber by the time Marcus eased the truck onto the shoulder near a stretch of desert scrub. The air was still thick with the scent of sage and sun-warmed gravel. He stepped out slowly, boots crunching the dirt, and stretched his arms skyward, his joints giving a familiar pop. The breeze tugged at the edge of his flannel shirt, and for a moment he just stood there watching the colors shift across the sky like a slow-motion fire. He wasn't running from anything. He wasn't chasing anything either. He was just moving forward the way he always had. Behind him, a day had been changed forever. People had seen what quiet strength looked like, not in the form of threats or noise, but in presence, in stillness, in a man who could end chaos with precision and return to his meal like nothing had happened. Marcus took a sip from the bottle of water he'd picked up back at the gas station. The kid working the counter, barely old enough to shave, had asked him, "You headed somewhere important?" He'd smiled. "Nope, just passing through." The same way he'd always lived. The thing about men like Marcus Hale is that they don't look for recognition. They don't seek out conflict. They don't post about their past or carry medals on their chest. But they carry something else, something that shows up the moment someone pushes too far. Discipline, clarity, restraint, and when necessary, action. Back in Eldridge, the sheriff sat with a lukewarm cup of coffee and replayed the stories he'd heard that afternoon. He didn't need to investigate. There'd been no crime, only correction, the kind no badge could enforce. He scratched his chin and muttered to himself, "Man like that." He was trained for war, but he used peace instead, and that thought settled in his chest like a weight, not a burden, just truth. The waitress Doris stood at the front of the diner with the blinds half drawn, watching the last rays of sunlight slip below the roof of the Shell station next door. Her hands were still trembling slightly, though not from fear anymore, from something else, respect. When the last customer left, she locked the door, turned off the buzzing open sign, and sat alone for a while at the same booth where Marcus had sat earlier that day. His coffee cup was still there, a faint ring of black at the bottom. The plate had long since been cleared, but his presence hadn't. It lingered. She looked down at the worn surface of the table and whispered to herself, "Just a guy eating lunch." Somewhere down the road, a hawk dipped lower, gliding along the edge of the highway. Marcus watched it through the windshield as he drove his thoughts somewhere between memory and instinct. He wasn't thinking about the diner anymore. Not about Royce. Not even about the people who watched it unfold. He was thinking about the next turn, the next town, the next cup of coffee. Because that's the thing about people like Marcus, men, shaped by discipline and softened by silence. They don't live to be seen. They live to be ready. Ready for the moment when the noise demands a response. But only if it matters. Only if someone crosses that line. Royce had learned that the hard way. So had the others. And they wouldn't forget it. Not because of bruises. Bruises heal. Egos inflate again. But memory sticks. Especially when it reminds you what you almost got away with and why you didn't. Eldridge would settle again. In a few days, things would return to normal. But the story would stay, not on a plaque, not in the paper, but in the whispers, in the way people glanced up when the door jingled open, in the caution behind cruelty. It had become one of those stories towns tell. I was there. I saw him. No, he didn't say much, but you felt it when he moved. And in that way, Marcus Hale became a part of that town's rhythm, even as he drove away from it. Because sometimes the people who leave the biggest mark are the ones who never ask you to remember them. They just live in a way that you can't forget. Some stories don't need a headline. They don't need music or a dramatic voiceover. They just need to be witnessed. What Marcus Hale did that day wasn't about dominance. It wasn't about teaching someone a lesson through violence. It was about holding the line, defending dignity, refusing provocation, and responding with control instead of chaos. And maybe that's what we all need to be reminded of sometimes. That real power doesn't come from how loud we are. It comes from knowing who we are. It comes from staying composed when others unravel, and from stepping forward only when it matters. Every town has its bullies. Every diner has its Royce, and sometimes they get away with it. But not always, because sometimes someone walks in who doesn't look the part, someone quiet, someone composed, someone who just wants a cheeseburger and coffee, but who happens to be a living reminder of what respect looks like when it's tested. If you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or had your strength questioned just because you didn't shout it into the room, this story's for you. Let it be a reminder. Stillness is not weakness. Silence is not submission. And true strength. True strength speaks when it's time and not a second before. Thank you for listening. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And as always, be safe. Stay kind. And never forget, you don't need to prove anything to anyone unless they cross that line.